Doctor mocks autistic patient, then learns she's the daughter of the governor. The bustling sound of the hospital echoed through the hallways as Dr. Alan Grant strode down the corridor, his white coat billowing behind him. A respected surgeon, Dr. Grant was known for his no-nonsense approach to medicine, his surgical precision matched only by his sharp tongue. His colleagues admired his skills, but his bedside manner often left much to be desired. "Morning, Dr. Grant," one of the nurses greeted as he passed. He offered a curt nod but didn't slow his pace. Time was money, and he didn't like wasting either. In the waiting room, a young girl sat quietly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie. She looked out of place amidst the sea of impatient patients and their families. Her name was Lila, and she was 14 years old. Her blue hoodie was a little too big, and her eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding contact with anyone who might glance her way. Beside her sat a man in a tailored suit, his face calm but his eyes filled with concern. This was her father, Edward Hayes, though few here would realize he was the state governor. "Do you want me to come in with you, sweetheart?" Edward asked gently, his voice low. Lila shook her head, her movements deliberate. "I'll be okay," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. Edward nodded, though he couldn't hide the flicker of worry that crossed his face. "If you need me, just say the word." Lila offered a small, fleeting smile before returning to the book in her lap. She didn't like hospitals. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the sounds too loud. But her father had insisted she see a specialist for the recurring pain in her wrist, and Lila had reluctantly agreed. Dr. Grant scanned the patient list on his tablet, barely glancing at the names. He prided himself on efficiency, get in, diagnose, and move on. When he reached Lila's name, he sighed. The note next to her appointment read, "Patient is autistic. May need accommodations." "Great," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't in the mood for what he assumed would be a long, drawn-out consultation. He entered the exam room without knocking, the door swinging open with a soft creak. Lila looked up, startled, while Edward remained seated, his hands clasped tightly together. "Lila Hayes?" Dr. Grant asked, glancing at the girl but directing his question more toward her father. Lila nodded, her fingers twisting the fabric of her hoodie. Dr. Grant pulled out her file, skimming through it. "Wrist pain, huh? Let's take a look." Lila hesitated, her eyes darting to her father, who gave her an encouraging nod. Slowly, she extended her hand toward Dr. Grant. He examined her wrist with brisk movements, his expression neutral but his tone sharp. "Does it hurt when I press here?" he asked, pushing on a specific spot. Lila winced and pulled her hand back slightly. "Yes." Dr. Grant raised an eyebrow. "And here?" He pressed another spot, eliciting the same reaction. "Yes," Lila said again, her voice quieter this time. He straightened up, scribbling notes on his clipboard. "Looks like a repetitive stress injury. Probably from overuse. Do you type a lot?" Lila shook her head. "I draw." "Ah," Dr. Grant said, his tone dismissive. "Well, that explains it. Artists always end up with these kinds of injuries. Maybe you should take a break." Lila frowned, her discomfort now as much emotional as it was physical. "But I can't." "Of course you can," Dr. Grant said with a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll thank me later." Edward cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension. "Dr. Grant, my daughter takes her art very seriously. Is there anything you can recommend to help her manage the pain without giving it up?" Dr. Grant glanced at Edward, a hint of irritation flickering across his face. "Rest is the best medicine. There's no magic cure for this." Lila looked down, her fingers fidgeting again. "But I need to finish my project," she said softly, almost to herself. Dr. Grant turned back to her, his tone turning brusque. "Look, kid, I get it. You like to draw. But sometimes you have to prioritize your health over your hobbies. You'll survive a few weeks without a pencil in your hand." Lila flinched at the word hobbies, her face flushing slightly. Edward stiffened but didn't speak, his eyes narrowing. After a moment, Dr. Grant sighed, clearly ready to move on. "I'll prescribe a brace to wear while you're drawing and recommend some stretches. But if you don't rest, it's going to get worse." "Understood." Lila nodded, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She avoided his gaze, her focus now fixed on the corner of the room. Dr. Grant turned to Edward, his tone clipped. "Any other questions?" Edward's voice was calm but carried an edge. "No, I think we're done here." Without another word, Dr. Grant left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. In the car ride home, Edward glanced at Lila in the passenger seat. She was quiet, her eyes fixed on the scenery outside. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Lila shrugged, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her hoodie. "He doesn't get it." "No, he doesn't," Edward agreed, his jaw tightening. "But that doesn't mean we'll stop fighting for what you need." Lila looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and frustration. "Thanks, Dad." Edward smiled softly. "Always." Later that evening, back at the hospital, Dr. Grant sat in the break room, scrolling through his phone. He barely remembered the appointment with Lila. To him, it had been just another routine consultation. But that would change soon. The chief of staff entered the room, her expression serious. "Alan, do you have a moment?" "Sure," Dr. Grant said, setting down his phone. "What's up?" She crossed her arms, her tone sharp. "Do you know who your patient was this morning?" "Lila Hayes?" Dr. Grant frowned, trying to recall. "Yeah, the kid with the wrist pain." "What about her?" The chief's eyes narrowed. "She's the daughter of Governor Edward Hayes." Dr. Grant blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. "Wait, what?" "You heard me," she said. "And I just got off the phone with him. He wasn't exactly impressed with your bedside manner." Dr. Grant felt his stomach drop. Look, I treated her like I would any other patient." "That's the problem," the chief said, her voice cold. "Governor Hayes said you dismissed her concerns and belittled her passion. He's not just her father, he's her advocate. And he's not happy." Dr. Grant leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He hadn't given the appointment a second thought, but now he realized he might have made a serious mistake. Dr. Grant sat frozen in his chair as the chief of staff left the room. Her words echoed in his mind. "Governor Hayes said you dismissed her concerns and belittled her passion." He replayed the interaction with Lila, his stomach twisting. At the time, it had seemed routine, a standard consultation. But now, with the knowledge of who she was and the weight of the governor's words, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had overlooked something important. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is going to be a problem," he muttered to himself. Later that evening, as he was finishing his shift, Dr. Grant's phone buzzed. It was an email from the hospital administration. The subject line read, "Meeting scheduled, Dr. Alan Grant and Governor Edward Hayes." His heart sank. He opened the email, skimming the details. The meeting was set for the following afternoon. It wasn't just with the governor, it would also include the chief of staff and the hospital board. Dr. Grant closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He knew he needed to prepare. The next day, Dr. Grant entered the boardroom, his usual confidence replaced by a tight knot of nerves. Governor Edward Hayes was already seated at the table, his expression calm but stern. Beside him sat a woman in her early 40s, Lila's mother, who had the same piercing eyes as her daughter. The chief of staff and several board members filled the remaining seats. "Dr. Grant," the governor began, his voice measured, "thank you for meeting with us today." Dr. Grant nodded, his throat dry. "Of course, Governor Hayes. I'm here to listen and address any concerns you have." The governor leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. "I'll be direct. Yesterday's consultation with my daughter was not what I expected from a physician of your reputation. Lila is autistic, and while I understand that not everyone has experience working with neurodivergent patients, I do expect her to be treated with respect and understanding." Dr. Grant swallowed hard. "I assure you, it was never my intention to disrespect her." "Intention or not," Lila's mother interjected, her voice sharp, she left that appointment feeling dismissed and humiliated. "Art is her world, Dr. Grant. It's how she communicates, how she processes the world around her. For you to call it a hobby, do you have any idea how much that undermined her?" Dr. Grant opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The governor continued, his tone steady but firm. "Lila doesn't need pity or condescension. What she needs is support. She's one of the most talented young artists I've ever seen, and she's worked incredibly hard to get where she is. Your job wasn't just to treat her wrist, it was to treat her as a person. The words hit Dr. Grant harder than he expected. He'd always prided himself on his medical expertise, but hearing how his actions, or lack thereof, had affected Lila left him feeling deeply unsettled. "I understand," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "I realize now that I could have handled the situation much better. I owe Lila an apology, and I'd like the chance to make things right." The governor studied him for a moment before nodding. "I appreciate that, Dr. Grant. But words aren't enough. Actions matter." Later that day, Dr. Grant reached out to the governor's office, requesting another meeting with Lila and her parents. He knew this wasn't just about smoothing things over, it was about taking responsibility and making a genuine effort to understand her needs. When the meeting was scheduled, Dr. Grant prepared himself meticulously. He read up on autism and the specific challenges faced by autistic individuals in healthcare settings. He consulted colleagues who had more experience working with neurodivergent patients, asking for advice on how to communicate effectively and respectfully. The meeting took place in a quieter, more comfortable room in the hospital, a space designed to feel less clinical. Lila sat beside her father, her hands fidgeting with a stress ball. She glanced at Dr. Grant but quickly looked away, her discomfort evident. Dr. Grant began with a deep breath. "Lila, I want to start by saying I'm sorry. Yesterday, I didn't take the time to understand you or what's important to you. I was wrong to dismiss your passion for art, and I realize now how much that hurt you. I want to do better." Lila glanced at her father, then back at Dr. Grant. "Okay," she said softly, though her tone was cautious. Dr. Grant smiled gently. "I've been learning more about how to support patients like you. Patients who see the world differently, who have unique strengths and challenges. And I'd like to work with you to figure out the best way to treat your wrist without asking you to stop doing what you love." Lila's expression softened slightly and she nodded. "That would be good." The rest of the meeting was spent discussing Lila's needs and goals. Dr. Grant suggested a new type of brace that would allow her more flexibility while drawing, along with regular physical therapy sessions to strengthen her wrist. He also recommended taking short breaks during long drawing sessions, not as a way to stop her passion, but to keep her healthy so she could continue pursuing it for years to come. By the end of the meeting, Lila seemed more at ease. She even offered a small smile as she thanked Dr. Grant. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Grant made it a point to check in on Lila's progress, both with her therapy and with her art. He even took an interest in her work, asking to see her sketches and marveling at her talent. It was a new experience for him, seeing a patient not just as a case to solve but as a whole person with dreams, struggles, and potential. One day, Lila brought a drawing to the hospital, shyly handing it to Dr. Grant. It was a detailed portrait of him, standing in his white coat with a thoughtful expression. In the corner, she had written, "Thank you for believing in me." Dr. Grant stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. "This is incredible, Lila." "Thank you." Lila smiled, her confidence growing. "You're welcome." The experience changed Dr. Grant. He began to approach all his patients with more empathy, taking the time to listen and understand their individual needs. His reputation shifted from being merely a brilliant surgeon to being a compassionate and patient-focused physician. And as for Lila, she continued to thrive. Her art gained recognition, and she was even invited to showcase her work at a prestigious gallery event. Dr. Grant attended the event alongside her parents, standing in the crowd as Lila's pieces were admired by all. He couldn't help but feel a swell of pride, not for himself, but for the young girl who had taught him the importance of humility, empathy, and seeing people for who they truly are. Months passed, and Lila's progress was remarkable. The combination of therapy, her new brace, and adjustments to her routine allowed her to return to her art with renewed vigor. Her confidence blossomed, and with it came opportunities that she had once only dreamed of. Dr. Grant found himself more invested in her journey than he ever expected. He often checked in with her during follow-up appointments, and their interactions became less formal and more personable. Lila no longer hesitated to speak, and she even began sharing stories about her latest projects. Dr. Grant realized how much he enjoyed seeing her light up when talking about her art. It reminded him of why he'd pursued medicine in the first place, to help people thrive. One day, during a routine checkup, Lila handed him a small, wrapped package. "I made this for you," she said, her voice steady but tinged with nervousness. Dr. Grant blinked in surprise as he unwrapped the gift. Inside was a framed sketch, a scene of a bustling hospital hallway, with doctors, nurses, and patients all intricately drawn. In the center was a figure unmistakably meant to be him, standing tall with a soft smile on his face. Above the scene, she had written, "Helping hands make a better world." Dr. Grant stared at the sketch, his throat tightening. "Lila, this is incredible." "Thank you." Lila smiled shyly. "I just wanted to say thanks. For listening. For helping." He nodded, his voice quieter than usual. "It's been my privilege." Meanwhile, Lila's artistic talent was gaining wider recognition. Her father, Governor Hayes, had always been proud of her, but now he saw the world recognizing what he had known all along. Lila's art was extraordinary. One of her pieces, a vibrant, emotional painting of a cityscape at dusk, was chosen as the centerpiece for a statewide campaign promoting autism awareness. The governor had been adamant that the campaign celebrate neurodivergent individuals' unique strengths, and Lila's work became its symbol. The launch event was held at a grand gallery downtown. The room was filled with community leaders, artists, and advocates, all there to celebrate Lila's accomplishment. Dr. Grant attended as well, at the personal invitation of the Hayes family. He stood in the back of the room, watching as Lila confidently spoke about her art and what it meant to her. "My art is how I speak," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's how I share my feelings and my perspective. For a long time, I thought people wouldn't understand it, or me. But I've learned that there are people who do listen, who care, and who want to help me shine. I'm grateful to them. And I hope my work can inspire others to believe in themselves, too." The crowd erupted into applause, and Dr. Grant found himself clapping harder than anyone. He felt a surge of pride, not just for Lila, but for the journey they had both taken to reach this point. She had taught him as much as he had helped her. After the event, Lila approached Dr. Grant, her parents by her side. "I'm glad you came," she said, her smile genuine. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," Dr. Grant replied. "You were incredible up there." "Thanks," she said, then hesitated for a moment before adding, "And thanks for everything. You've really helped me." Dr. Grant smiled. "You've helped me too. More than you know." Edward Hayes stepped forward, extending a hand to Dr. Grant. "You've made a real difference, Doctor. Not just for Lila, but for our entire family. We won't forget it." Dr. Grant shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Governor. But the truth is, your daughter did most of the work. I just tried to keep up." Lila laughed softly, the sound warm and light. "Well, you did a pretty good job." Over time, the changes in Dr. Grant's practice became evident to everyone around him. His once brusque demeanor had softened, and his patients began speaking about how attentive and compassionate he had become. He had started to see medicine not just as a science, but as an art, a lesson he credited to Lila and her family. One day, as he prepared for his next patient, he glanced at the framed drawing Lila had given him. It hung on the wall of his office, a daily reminder of the power of connection and understanding. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called. A nurse stepped in, handing him a file. "Your next patient is here. Young artist with wrist pain." Dr. Grant smiled, his mind flashing back to his first meeting with Lila. "Let's make sure we get it right this time." That evening, after his shift, Dr. Grant took a walk through the park. The cool breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant sound of children playing filled the air. As he sat on a bench, he thought about how much his life had changed over the past few months. He thought about Lila's journey, her strength, and the lessons she had taught him. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Lila's father. "Thank you for trusting me with Lila's care. She's an incredible young woman. I'm grateful for the opportunity to have been part of her story." A reply came almost immediately. "And we're grateful you took the time to see her for who she truly is. That's what made all the difference." Dr. Grant smiled, slipping his phone back into his pocket. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly fulfilled, not just as a doctor, but as a person. Dr. Grant's transformation didn't just stop with Lila's case. Over time, he began advocating for better training in working with neurodivergent patients, both within his hospital and at medical conferences. He realized how much he had taken for granted in his profession, the assumptions, the biases, the shortcuts that had allowed him to miss the deeper human stories behind each diagnosis. One afternoon, a colleague approached him in the hospital lounge. "Alan," she said, holding a cup of coffee, "I heard about the new initiative you're proposing. Training for doctors on how to better interact with neurodivergent patients? That's not something I'd expect from you." Dr. Grant smiled faintly, not taking offense. "People change, Megan. I've learned that treating the symptoms isn't enough. We have to treat the whole person. That includes understanding how they think, how they feel, and what matters to them." Megan sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Well, I think it's a great idea. It's about time we started doing more in that area." "It's overdue," Dr. Grant admitted. "But better late than never." Meanwhile, Lila's art continued to gain recognition. Her painting from the Autism Awareness Campaign was featured in several publications, and her work became a beacon of hope for many young artists who saw themselves in her story. She even started an online community for neurodivergent artists, encouraging them to share their work and support one another. One day, as she was working on a new piece in her home studio, her father entered the room, holding his phone. "Lila," he said with a proud smile, "Dr. Grant just sent me a message. He wanted me to let you know that your story inspired him to give a talk at the National Medical Conference next month." Lila looked up, surprised. "A talk about what?" "About what he learned from treating you," Edward said, sitting down beside her. "About how you taught him to see the world differently. He said you're the reason he's trying to make healthcare better for people like you." Lila's cheeks flushed and she smiled softly. "That's cool. I'm glad." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've made an impact, sweetheart. Not just on him, but on so many people. You should be proud of that." "I am," Lila said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I couldn't have done it without you and Mom. And maybe even Dr. Grant." Edward chuckled. "He's come a long way, hasn't he?" Lila nodded. "Yeah, we all have." The day of Dr. Grant's talk arrived, and the conference hall buzzed with anticipation. The audience, a mix of medical professionals and advocates, listened intently as he took the stage. "I've been a doctor for over 20 years, Dr. Grant began, his voice steady. "And in that time, I've learned a lot about medicine. But the most important lessons I've learned have come from my patients. One patient, in particular, changed the way I see my work, my responsibilities, and, frankly, myself." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Her name is Lila Hayes. She's an incredible young artist who happens to be autistic. When I first treated her, I failed to see her as more than a diagnosis. I dismissed her passion, her voice, and her perspective. And in doing so, I failed her." The room was silent, every eye on him. Dr. Grant continued, his tone more reflective. "But Lila taught me something invaluable. She showed me the power of listening, of understanding, of treating the whole person rather than just the symptoms. She reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place, not just to heal bodies, but to support lives." He glanced at the screen behind him, where a slide of Lila's painting was displayed. "This is one of Lila's works. It represents connection, creativity, and resilience. And it's a reminder to all of us in this room that we have a responsibility, not just to cure, but to care." The audience erupted into applause, many standing as they clapped. Dr. Grant felt a wave of emotion he hadn't anticipated, but he welcomed it. This wasn't just about his growth, it was about honoring the journey he and Lila had shared. Back home, Lila and her parents watched a recording of the talk on their living room TV. Lila's eyes widened as she saw her painting on the screen, accompanied by Dr. Grant's words of praise. "Wow," she said softly. "He really did that?" "He did," her mother said, smiling. "And it's because of you." Lila leaned back on the couch, a small but proud smile on her face. "That's pretty cool." Edward chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Pretty cool doesn't even begin to cover it, sweetheart." In the months that followed, Dr. Grant's initiative gained traction, leading to new training programs in hospitals across the state. Lila continued to thrive, balancing her art with her advocacy work. And though their paths didn't cross as often, the bond between Lila and Dr. Grant remained strong, a testament to the way people can learn, grow, and change. As Dr. Grant walked through the halls of his hospital one evening, he glanced at the framed sketch Lila had given him, hanging proudly on his office wall. It was a constant reminder of the journey they had taken together and the lessons that had shaped him. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace, not because of his accolades or his skill, but because he had learned to see the humanity in every patient, starting with a quiet, determined girl in a blue hoodie who had taught him how to truly listen. In the weeks following his talk at the medical conference, Dr. Grant began to view his work and his life through a different lens. He no longer rushed through his consultations, nor did he treat his patients as mere names on a chart. Instead, he started asking questions not just about symptoms, but about the people behind them. One day, during a routine consultation with an elderly woman suffering from chronic back pain, he noticed her fidgeting with a small, hand-knitted scarf. "That's beautiful," he remarked, gesturing to the scarf. "Did you make it?" The woman's face lit up. "Oh yes, I've been knitting since I was a girl. It's my way of relaxing, you know? My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, but I still try." Dr. Grant smiled. "It's impressive. Have you thought about how we can protect your hands and back so you can keep doing what you love?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time in the appointment, she looked hopeful. "You can help with that?" "I'll do my best," he said sincerely. And he meant it. While Dr. Grant was making changes within his hospital, Lila's world was also expanding. The success of her autism awareness campaign had given her a platform she never imagined. At first, the attention was overwhelming. Strangers reached out on social media to praise her artwork, share their stories, and thank her for inspiring them. Some of their messages were deeply personal, and Lila found herself moved by the outpouring of connection. "Dad," she said one evening as they sat on the couch, scrolling through the messages on her phone. "Do you think I could do more?" Edward looked up from his book, studying her expression. "What do you mean?" "Well," she began, fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie, "people are saying my art helped them feel seen. What if I could, do that on purpose? Make more art that helps people?" Edward smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. And I'll support you however I can." Encouraged by her father's words, Lila began creating a new series of paintings. Each piece depicted moments of connection, resilience, and quiet strength. One painting showed a young boy reaching out to hold his mother's hand, the bond between them captured in vibrant, glowing hues. Another depicted a classroom full of students, with one child standing at the back, her face thoughtful and distant, yet surrounded by an aura of light that suggested she had more to offer than anyone realized. Meanwhile, Dr. Grant continued to grow. One day, during a staff meeting, he proposed a new program, a patient advocacy group that would include neurodivergent individuals and their families. The group would advise the hospital on how to create a more inclusive and accommodating environment. "It's not just about policies," Dr. Grant explained to the room of doctors and administrators. "It's about changing how we think about care. If we listen to our patients and understand their unique needs, we can provide better treatment and build trust." At first, the idea was met with skepticism. One colleague, Dr. Peters, raised an eyebrow. "Alan, this isn't a community center. It's a hospital. We're here to treat illnesses, not run focus groups." Dr. Grant met his gaze evenly. "We're here to treat people, not just illnesses. If we ignore their experiences, we're only doing half the job." The room fell silent. Slowly, the chief of staff nodded. "Let's try it. But you'll need to lead it." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Dr. Grant replied. The inaugural meeting of the advocacy group took place in a bright, welcoming conference room. The participants included patients, their families, and hospital staff. To Dr. Grant's surprise, Lila and her father were among the attendees. "Governor Hayes," he said, shaking Edward's hand. "Thank you for coming." Edward smiled. "Call me Edward. We're here as parents today, not as public figures." Lila stood beside her father, clutching a sketchpad. She gave Dr. Grant a small, shy smile. "Hi." "Hi, Lila," Dr. Grant said warmly. "I'm glad you're here." The meeting began with introductions, followed by an open discussion about the challenges patients faced in the hospital setting. Lila listened quietly for most of the session, but toward the end she raised her hand. "I think it's important," she began, her voice steady, "that doctors don't assume they know everything about their patients. Even if they're experts about medicine, they're not experts about us. We know ourselves best." Her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone in the room. Dr. Grant nodded, his respect for her growing even deeper. "You're absolutely right, Lila. Thank you for saying that." As Lila's advocacy work grew, so did the demands on her time. She was invited to speak at events, contribute her artwork to campaigns, and even collaborate with organizations that supported neurodivergent individuals. While she was grateful for the opportunities, the pressure sometimes felt overwhelming. One evening, as she sat in her room staring at a blank canvas, she felt a familiar wave of anxiety creeping in. Her father knocked on the door and entered, his expression concerned. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently. "Everything okay?" Lila shook her head, her hands twisting together. What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess this up?" Edward sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Lila, you've already done more than most people ever dream of. You don't have to be perfect. Just be yourself." "But what if that's not enough?" she whispered. Edward smiled softly. "It is. It always has been." Months later, Dr. Grant received a letter in the mail. It was from Lila, inviting him to the unveiling of her latest art exhibit. The event was titled "Through My Eyes," a celebration of neurodivergence. When Dr. Grant arrived at the gallery, he was struck by the beauty and power of Lila's work. Each piece told a story, capturing moments of joy, struggle, and triumph. One painting in particular caught his eye. It depicted a hospital hallway, much like the one where he worked. In the center of the scene stood a doctor, his posture confident but his expression kind. The title read, "Listening Matters." Lila approached him as he stood before the painting. "Do you like it?" she asked. Dr. Grant turned to her, his voice filled with emotion. "It's extraordinary, Lila." "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said. "It's what you taught me." Dr. Grant shook his head. "No, Lila. You taught me." Years later, both Lila and Dr. Grant would look back on their shared journey as a turning point in their lives. Lila went on to become a celebrated artist and advocate, using her platform to inspire and empower others. Dr. Grant became a leader in patient-centered care, transforming his hospital into a model of inclusivity and empathy. Their paths crossed occasionally at events and conferences, each time marked by warm smiles and mutual respect. And while their lives took them in different directions, the lessons they had learned from each other remained a constant source of strength and purpose. In the end, it wasn't just about a doctor and a patient. It was about two people who saw each other for who they truly were and, in doing so, changed not only themselves but the world around them. Despite her growing recognition as an artist, Lila still faced challenges at school. While some of her teachers were supportive and celebrated her talents, others struggled to understand her unique way of learning and expressing herself. One of her most difficult subjects was math, where rote memorization of formulas often clashed with her preference for visual, intuitive learning. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating day at school, Lila came home and dropped her bag by the door with a heavy sigh. Her mother, Karen, noticed her slump and followed her into the kitchen. "Rough day?" Karen asked, pouring Lila a glass of lemonade. Lila nodded, her expression downcast. "It's like no matter how hard I try, I can't get it right. My math teacher says I'm not focusing enough, but I don't think she understands." Karen sat across from her, her face thoughtful. "You know, you've figured out so much about art on your own. Maybe there's a way to approach math the same way. What if we tried turning it into something visual?" Lila tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Karen grabbed a stack of colored pencils and some graph paper. Together, they started sketching shapes and diagrams to represent equations. By the end of the evening, Lila was smiling for the first time in days. "This actually makes sense," she said, her excitement palpable. Karen smiled. "There's always a way to learn. You just have to find what works for you." Lila carried this newfound confidence into her next math class, surprising her teacher with her creative approach to solving problems. Over time, her progress inspired her classmates, and even her teacher began to see the value in thinking outside the box. Dr. Grant's transformation at work didn't go unnoticed. Younger doctors and medical students began seeking him out for advice, drawn to his empathetic approach to patient care. At first, Dr. Grant wasn't sure how to respond to the attention. He had never thought of himself as a mentor, but he soon realized the importance of passing on what he had learned. One evening, a young resident named Dr. Hannah Lee approached him after a staff meeting. "Dr. Grant," she began hesitantly, "do you have a moment?" "Of course," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've been struggling with a patient," she admitted. "He's a teenager with anxiety, and no matter what I say, he just shuts down. I feel like I'm failing him." Dr. Grant nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been there. Sometimes, it's not about what you say, it's about how you listen. Have you tried asking him what makes him feel comfortable?" Dr. Lee frowned. "Not really. I've been so focused on finding a solution that I didn't think to ask." "Start there," Dr. Grant advised. "Let him guide the conversation. You might be surprised by what he tells you." A week later, Dr. Lee sought him out again, her face alight with excitement. "It worked," she said. "I asked him what he needed and he opened up. He said he felt overwhelmed by the noise in the hospital, so we started meeting in a quieter room. He's actually talking to me now." Dr. Grant smiled, pride warming his chest. "That's fantastic, Dr. Lee. Remember, every patient is different. The more you listen, the better you'll be able to help." One day, Lila received an invitation to speak at a youth leadership conference about her journey as an autistic artist and advocate. At first, she was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't something she had ever felt comfortable with. "Do I have to?" she asked her father, her voice tinged with anxiety. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Edward assured her. "But think about it, Lila. You have an incredible story to share, and this could be a chance to inspire even more people." Lila thought about it for several days, weighing her fear against the opportunity to make a difference. Finally, she decided to give it a try. She spent weeks preparing her speech, practicing in front of her family, and even recording herself to work on her delivery. When the day of the event arrived, Lila stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her notes. Dr. Grant, who had been invited as a guest, noticed her nervousness and approached her. "You're going to do great," he said, his tone reassuring. "Just speak from your heart. That's what people will remember." Lila nodded, taking a deep breath. When she stepped onto the stage, the spotlight felt blinding at first, but as she began to speak, her confidence grew. "I used to think that being different was something to hide," she said, her voice steady. "But now I know that my differences are my strength. My art is how I share my world, and I hope it helps others feel seen and understood." The audience erupted into applause when she finished, many rising to their feet. Lila's smile was radiant as she left the stage, her heart full. Following her speech, Lila was approached by a non-profit organization that worked with neurodivergent youth. They proposed a collaborative art project, a mural that would be painted by autistic children and teens from across the state. Lila was thrilled by the idea and agreed to lead the project. Over the next few months, she traveled to different communities, meeting young artists and helping them contribute their unique visions to the mural. Each piece of the mural told a different story, from a swirling galaxy that represented curiosity to a quiet forest that symbolized peace. When the mural was finally unveiled, it stretched across an entire wall of the city's community center. Hundreds of people gathered for the event, including Dr. Grant and his colleagues. As Lila spoke about the project, her voice filled with pride, Dr. Grant felt a deep sense of gratitude for having been part of her journey. As time went on, both Lila and Dr. Grant continued to make an impact in their respective fields. Lila's art and advocacy brought visibility to the autistic community, while Dr. Grant's initiatives transformed his hospital into a national leader in patient-centered care. Their paths crossed many times over the years, each meeting a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had learned from each other. And while their journeys were their own, they both knew they had left an indelible mark on each other's lives. One quiet afternoon years later, Dr. Grant received a letter in the mail. It was from Lila, now a successful artist and public figure. Inside was a print of one of her latest paintings, a depiction of two hands reaching out to each other, surrounded by vibrant colors that seemed to pulse with life. Beneath the image, she had written a simple note. "Thank you for listening. You changed my life." Dr. Grant placed the letter on his desk, his eyes misty. For a moment, he simply sat there, reflecting on the journey they had shared. Then, with a quiet smile, he framed the painting and hung it beside Lila's original drawing in his office, a permanent reminder of the power of connection, compassion, and growth. As Dr. Grant's efforts to make healthcare more inclusive gained recognition, he was invited to join a national task force dedicated to improving medical practices for neurodivergent patients. This task force included doctors, psychologists, educators, and advocates, including individuals on the autism spectrum. One of the first meetings took place in Washington, D.C., in a grand conference hall filled with passionate professionals from across the country. Dr. Grant sat alongside people whose experiences and perspectives humbled him. One of them was an autistic advocate named Maya, who shared her struggles navigating healthcare. "Doctors often speak about us, not to us," Maya said, her voice steady but firm. "They think they know what's best without asking us what we need. That's the first thing that needs to change." Dr. Grant nodded, her words hitting home. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I used to be one of those doctors. But I've learned that listening is the most powerful tool we have. It took a young patient of mine to show me that." Maya smiled slightly. "Sounds like she taught you well." "She did," Dr. Grant replied, his thoughts briefly turning to Lila. Lila's collaborative mural project quickly became more than just a local success. Photos of the mural began circulating online, sparking conversations about neurodivergent creativity and inclusion. Soon, an international arts organization reached out, inviting Lila to showcase the mural's story at a global art exhibition in Paris. At first, Lila was hesitant. Traveling to a foreign country, speaking in front of an even larger audience, these were challenges that felt overwhelming. But her family and friends, including Dr. Grant, encouraged her to take the leap. "You've already inspired so many people, Lila," Dr. Grant told her during a phone call. "This is your chance to show the world what you've accomplished. And I'll be cheering you on every step of the way." With their support, Lila agreed. She traveled to Paris with her parents, bringing along a series of smaller paintings that represented the mural's themes. The exhibition was held in a stunning gallery overlooking the Seine, its halls filled with artwork from around the world. When it was Lila's turn to present, she stood in front of a crowd of artists, curators, and journalists, her hands gripping the edges of the podium. Her voice trembled slightly as she began, but as she spoke about the mural and the young artists who had contributed to it, her confidence grew. "This mural isn't just a collection of paintings," she said. "It's a story of connection, of voices coming together to create something bigger than any one of us. It's a reminder that everyone has something valuable to share, if we take the time to listen." The audience erupted into applause, and several people approached her afterward, praising her work and asking to collaborate. For Lila, it was a moment of validation, not just for her art, but for her journey as a person and an advocate. Back in the hospital, Dr. Grant received an unexpected letter from one of his former patients, a young boy named Ryan who had struggled with severe anxiety. Dr. Grant remembered how difficult those early sessions had been, with Ryan barely able to speak above a whisper. The letter read, "Dear Dr. Grant, thank you for being patient with me. You listened when no one else did, and because of that, I've started to believe in myself again. I'm now part of a youth theater group, and I'm performing in my first play next month. I never thought I could do something like this, but you helped me see that I could. Thank you for everything." Dr. Grant reread the letter several times, his chest tightening with emotion. Moments like these reminded him of why he had chosen this path, not just to heal, but to empower. He decided to attend Ryan's play, sitting quietly in the back row as the boy delivered a heartfelt monologue. Watching him on stage, Dr. Grant felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just for Ryan, but for the ripple effect of compassion and understanding. As Lila's recognition grew, she began mentoring other young autistic artists who were just starting their journeys. One of them was a shy girl named Mia, who struggled with expressing herself in words but came alive through her drawings. During one of their sessions, Mia showed Lila a sketch of a stormy ocean, its waves crashing against jagged rocks. "It's how I feel sometimes," Mia explained softly. "Like everything's too much." Lila nodded, understanding immediately. "I know that feeling," she said, "but you've captured it so beautifully. Art can help you make sense of it, piece by piece." Mia's eyes brightened. "Do you ever feel like it helps other people too? Like they can see what we see?" "Absolutely," Lila said with a smile. "Your art is a bridge. It helps people understand you, and it shows them things they might not have seen otherwise." Inspired by Lila's encouragement, Mia entered her first art competition a few months later and won. Lila attended the award ceremony, cheering loudly as Mia accepted her prize. Seeing Mia's joy reminded Lila of her own journey and the importance of paying it forward. A year after Lila's mural project, she and Dr. Grant reunited at a conference on neurodivergence in the arts. Both were invited as keynote speakers, Lila to talk about her art and advocacy, and Dr. Grant to discuss his efforts to improve healthcare for neurodivergent patients. When Lila saw Dr. Grant in the lobby, her face lit up. "Dr. Grant," she called, waving him over. He smiled, walking toward her. "Lila, it's good to see you. How's life as a famous artist?" She laughed. "Busy but good. How about you? Changing the world one patient at a time?" "Something like that," he said with a chuckle. "But I think you're the real star here." During the conference, both of their talks were met with standing ovations. Afterward, they sat together in the green room, reflecting on how far they had come. "I never thought that one appointment could change so much," Dr. Grant said. "You've taught me more than I ever thought possible. And you've shown me that people can change," Lila replied. "You listened, and that made all the difference." Years later, Lila and Dr. Grant's contributions would continue to impact countless lives. Lila's art became part of permanent exhibits in museums around the world, her pieces celebrated for their depth and emotional resonance. Dr. Grant's advocacy work reshaped medical practices, inspiring a new generation of doctors to prioritize empathy and understanding. One day, as Lila walked through an art gallery featuring her work, she stopped in front of a painting she had created years earlier. It was the piece she had given to Dr. Grant, a hospital hallway with a kind doctor at its center. She smiled, remembering everything that painting represented. In another part of the country, Dr. Grant sat in his office, now semi-retired but still mentoring young doctors. On his desk sat the framed sketch Lila had given him, a constant reminder of the lessons they had taught each other. And though their journeys had taken them in different directions, their shared legacy continued, a testament to the power of empathy, connection, and the courage to grow.